Thanks for joining us for this Zero Waste video series segment. The Zero Waste video series is organized by Waste Free Advocates, formerly Recycling Advocates, an Oregon-based nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering and connecting Oregon communities to minimize overconsumption and waste. With this video series, we are seeking to not only inform folks who are interested in learning about zero waste efforts within our region, but also to connect to entrepreneurial, government, and community advocates to help strengthen our growing network so that we can help each other in growing these positive and impactful practices and infrastructure. Please write in your questions and suggestions in the comments where we're going to be continuing the conversation.
Today, we are excited to be speaking with David Allaway with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. David has worked at the intersection of waste and materials and the environment for over 30 years, and he's currently a senior policy analyst at DEQ. And in 2019 and 2020, he served as co-chair of Oregon's Recycling Steering Committee and contributed to the development of the 2021 Oregon Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act. And also, he recently served as an advisor to Paul Hawken's Project Drawdown and the New York Times bestseller, Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. So welcome, David. First, I want to talk about the status of Oregon landfill. So do we have space and resources to continue on our current path? And, what does the future of landfill look like in Oregon?
That's a great question. Well, for those of us who are more than a few decades old, you can remember a time in which it looked like we were going to run out of landfill space. And landfills were major sources of pollution. In the late 1980s, the federal government changed a number of laws that really tightened the regulatory controls on landfills. And as a consequence, a whole bunch of landfills closed. They could no longer afford to comply with those new requirements. And it appeared that we were going to run out of places to put our waste. But those small, dirty, polluting landfills were replaced with a new generation of massive, efficient, and let me say, relatively clean landfills. And that's what most of Oregon is served with today. We have, in fact, hundreds of years of landfill capacity in the state. There are a few parts in the state that are currently relying on local, smaller landfills, and those landfills will eventually close. But those communities will probably do what the rest of the state does, which is truck their waste across the state to one of these mega landfills in the eastern Columbia Gorge. And these large landfills remain sources of pollution, but they are nothing compared to the pollution that the old generation of landfills used to produce.
Great. Good to know. Okay. So how does this tie into recycling? What does this have to do with recycling?
Yeah, well, let's step back a moment and reflect on the fact that while this state does not have a landfill capacity crisis, we are experiencing and contributing to a number of much more profound environmental crises. And those include the climate crisis, which I assume with this audience I don't need to explain or justify. But we're also in the midst of one of the greatest mass extinctions of species in the history of this planet. We are choking marine ecosystems with nutrient runoff, and we're continuing to dump dangerous toxic chemicals that are recirculating throughout the globe and showing up in the most remote environments of the earth and in the blood of unborn babies. And these problems, including climate change, are far more serious and a far greater threat to our individual and collective well-being than landfill capacity is. The thing is that the quantity and the types of materials we are using and how those materials are produced, sourced and produced, are significant contributions to all of these perils. And this is where recycling can contribute to reducing the impacts. Let me zero in for just a moment on climate, because climate is one of the ones where I have a few numbers, and I'm a bit of a numbers guy. So we have as a state two different methods of accounting for greenhouse gases for our state's contribution to climate change. The first method looks at all the emissions inside the state's borders. The second method looks at the global emissions resulting from all the stuff that Oregonians consume. And in that second approach, which is called the consumption-based inventory, we find that the consumption of materials consistently contributes more than 40% to our global carbon footprint. And that's the food we buy, the clothes we wear, the materials used to construct our homes and businesses. Materials have a huge impact on climate. And while the numbers are not as clear for other types of environmental impacts, it looks like materials are even more impactful when we're talking about nutrient loading in the oceans or toxics in the environment. And it's important to understand that most of these impacts are a consequence of activities that are upstream of the individual, especially the extraction of raw materials from the environment and the conversion of those raw materials into primary materials such as aluminum or steel. So by the time you buy something at the store, most of the environmental damage has already been done. From a climate perspective, about 99% of the carbon footprint of materials is in production, compared to only about 1% being disposal. So how does recycling fit in? Obviously, recycling reduces the impacts of disposal, because if you put less stuff in the landfill or the incinerator, there's fewer impacts there. But the less obvious and frankly more profound benefit of recycling is that when we recycle materials, that is, when we separate materials in our homes or businesses and make them available to industry to be used to make new products, typically that results in a reduction of fossil fuel energy, a reduction of greenhouse gases, and a reduction of a number of other pollutants. And that we call upstream benefit of recycling is larger and more important than the benefits of keeping stuff out of landfills. Now, having said that, in order for recycling to realize benefits, recycling needs to be done well, and not all recycling is done well. At present, this country is recycling a lot of plastics, and some of that plastics recycling does deliver the benefits that I just described. And some of that recycling ends up being exported to other countries where some of the plastics are recycled and the rest are dumped and burned or end up in the oceans. And so we do have some issues with our recycling system that need to be improved. But generally speaking, when recycling is done well, it delivers those sorts of environmental benefits.
Okay, so you're saying that even though we have plenty of places to put our garbage, recycling is still beneficial, but it also isn't enough?
That's right. Oregon is among the better states in the country in terms of recycling. And today, recycling by Oregonians is reducing greenhouse gas emissions by an amount equivalent to about 3, maybe 3.5% of our total statewide emissions. So that's not trivial. That's a meaningful reduction. And we can do more, although most of the low-hanging fruit in recycling has already been picked. So if we did a radical expansion of recycling and composting, I mean, like beyond what anyone in the world has ever done, and got to 90, 95% recycling or composting, we might reduce those greenhouse gas emissions by another 1 or 2%. Again, that's helpful. It's very helpful. We need more recycling. We need better recycling. We need recycling to be done well. But the science community is pretty clear. In order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, and here I'm talking about the deaths of millions of people and the permanent displacement of hundreds of millions of people from their homes and the potential extinction of 40% of the world's species, we need to reduce our emissions by 90%. Materials contribute about 40%. Recycling can reduce that 40% some, but maybe only about 1/7 or 1/6. So recycling is beneficial, but it's very limited. It should not be the only tool in our toolbox, and it really shouldn't even be the tool that we're leading with.
Okay. So then what do you think some of the other solutions are?
Well, let's start with the one that everybody has heard of, but so many people have forgotten about. And if you remember that old adage that goes reduce, reuse, recycle, What a lot of people don't realize or seem to have forgotten is that the idea of reduce, reuse, recycle is actually a hierarchy of options in preferred rank order. And the reason that reduce and reuse are above recycling is because they have much greater potential for environmental benefit. And let me offer you an example of this, and it involves the delivery of drinking water. There are some very clever folks in the marketing departments of some pretty big companies who have convinced a lot of people that the very best water comes in individual single-use bottles, and that those bottles are somehow or other free of any impact to the environment, so long as you, as the individual, act responsibly and recycle them. So we ran the numbers on that. In fact, we have a 500+ page report on our website that evaluates the environmental impacts of, I think, 36 different methods. Maybe it's 40. It's a large number of different methods of delivering drinking water. And what we found is that while using and recycling single-use plastic bottles is less impactful to the environment than using those same plastic bottles and disposing of them, the benefits of recycling are relatively modest. And in contrast, if you were to drink water out of the tap in a refillable bottle, doesn't really matter what the bottle's made of, just a refillable bottle, and you wash that reusable bottle, say, once a week in an Energy Star dishwasher, that can reduce the impacts of those bottled water, of those water bottles, by upwards of 98 or 99% for most types of environmental impacts, even when you account for all the impacts of making the refillable bottles and running the dishwasher. And there are other examples like this, and while there are exceptions, they all suggest that reduce and reuse are almost always better than recycling. So start there. But then let's remember that reduce, reuse, recycle are called the waste management hierarchy. And the problem we have is fundamentally not a problem of waste. It's a problem of unsustainable production and consumption. So there's a whole family of strategies that involves changing how materials are made so that they are made to be less impactful in the first place. Sometimes that's called sustainable production. And then we have to bring consumption into the conversation and bring absolute levels of consumption down to levels such that the impacts of that consumption, after you produce things with low impacts and you reduce, reuse, recycle as much as you can, that the absolute impacts of that consumption on the globe can be sustained in perpetuity. So reduce, reuse, recycle, sustainable production, and then addressing consumption are sort of the three legs of the proverbial stool.
That's a great reminder that reduce, reuse, recycle is more of a pyramid than just a slogan. So remembering that in order is important. Are there any examples of maybe regions or other states or countries outside of Oregon and the US that are doing, a stellar job with waste reduction or implementing a circular economy?
Well, that's a very rich question because it depends entirely on how you define a circular economy, which is the big buzzword right now in both policy circles and the corporate sustainability space. So let's unpack that one first. There's a lot of people that assume that a circular economy is simply an economy where all materials are kept in loops and there's no disposal and everything is recycled. Let me just add, as a physicist, this is thermodynamically impossible to keep all materials in perpetual loops. But ironically, it turns out that such an economy is not necessarily a sustainable one. Because again, we don't have a landfill crisis, we have a climate crisis, and we have an ecosystem crisis. And using massive amounts of materials, as we currently do, making them in damaging ways, and then recycling them all is a bit like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It's a lot of busy work, and it might provide a lot of satisfaction to a lot of people, but it simply isn't sufficient. So let's take a deeper dive and look at how making everything recyclable and recycling it can actually backfire. I'm going to use one more example, and this one involves coffee packaging. Just a disclaimer here. Everyone loves to talk about packaging, but oftentimes it's the product that is more impactful than the packaging. And environmentally, that is very true for coffee, especially if you drink your coffee with milk in it. So I run the risk here of focusing on the less important part of the problem, but let's sort of zero in on packaging for a minute. So if you've ever gone and purchased coffee at the store, you know there's several different ways in which coffee can be packaged. It can be packaged in a steel can. It can be in a plastic tub. It can be in something called a plastic can. And then there are these sealed bags. So of those four options, the first three, the steel can, the plastic tub, the plastic can, they are widely accepted in many recycling collection systems in Oregon and across the country. The last option, which is the sealed bag, is typically not accepted in recycling programs. And the reason is the bags are an absolute nightmare to recycle. They're typically a multi-material laminate, including different layers of different plastics and metal and sometimes paper. It's virtually impossible or impractical to separate those materials. And the only responsible thing to do with the packaging once you're done with it is to landfill it. And yet those super lightweight laminate bags are very lightweight. They require less material to produce. They require less energy to ship them. And when you add up the environmental impacts of making, transporting, and recycling or disposing of these different packaging formats, given current recycling rates, what we find is that the bags are the lowest impact material. That is, they result in the lowest amount of fossil fuel consumption, the lowest amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and so forth. Now that assumes current national recycling rates, which are a little underwhelming. So just to check, we ran the numbers again, and we modeled what the impacts would be if the recyclable steel can or the plastic tub or the plastic jar were recycled at a rate of 100%. Now that's, by the way, not practical. No one has ever accomplished that at a society-wide level, but just to be generous, we said, what if you could recycle 100% of these recyclable packages? And what we found is that even then, in the majority of different types of impacts we evaluated, the non-recyclable flexible bag still came out as having the lowest impacts to the environment, so long as it's disposed of in a landfill and not in the ocean. And fortunately, in this country, that's where most of our non-recycled waste go to, is they go to the landfill. So despite this evidence, there's a large number of brands and governments and environmental groups that remain somewhat stuck in what I would call a historic and oversimplified narrative in which recycling is always virtuous and landfills are always evil. And because of that narrative, they're promoting policies that would actually prohibit non-recyclable packaging from being sold in commerce. So if circular economy means requiring that coffee is only packaged in recyclable packaging, if we don't allow coffee to be packaged in these hyper-efficient lightweight bags, even though those bags are difficult to recycle, then what we're going to get at the end of the day is higher climate impacts and more natural resource consumption and a misguided but warm, fuzzy feeling that somehow or another we're helping the environment by recycling everything. So back to your question, who's doing a great job with the circular economy? There are a bunch of states and nations that are making really significant progress on improving our recycling systems. And Oregon is also on that path, especially with the passage of the 2021 Recycling Modernization Act. We need more recycling. And more importantly, we need recycling systems to work better. And this Oregon legislation will do that. It's very exciting. But we cannot recycle our way out of these environmental problems. Recycling is necessary, but it's absolutely insufficient. And the sad news is that most of the policy advancements happening are all about recycling. There is much less happening around prevention or reuse, or dematerialization, or sustainable production or sustainable consumption. Both globally and locally, I'm very sad to say that society as a whole is approaching the problems of materials entirely wrong. In fact, we're upside down. We're focusing on the solutions that are easy and popular, but less meaningful. And we're focusing less on the solutions that are more difficult, but also more necessary. And one of the reasons is that recycling seems to have consumed most of the oxygen in the room. But there are some glimmers of hope.
Such as, what are some of the glimmers?
Well, let me share some glimmers that are actually happening here in Oregon, and we're really pleased to be a part of this. Oregon is doing some really interesting work in this space. On a per capita basis, I think our state probably invests more in programs to prevent the wasting of food than most other states. And here, I'm not talking about composting. I'm talking about actual prevention. The same can be said for the reuse of building materials. We have a really good network across the state of places that reuse building materials. DEQ also recently pioneered a micro grant program to help grow small businesses in the reuse and repair sectors. And there are businesses such as the Renewal Workshop in Cascade Locks that are doing some really important work to make reuse and repair of materials viable. There's also, I mentioned the Recycling Modernization Act, which Governor Brown just signed into law this summer. It is largely about improving the state's recycling system, but many of the improvements will improve the quality of the social and environmental outcomes. The act is not just about recycling more. So for example, I mentioned the problem with the plastics that get collected for recycling and then get shipped off to places where they end up causing environmental harm. The Oregon Recycling Modernization Act sets up a number of safeguards to close those loopholes. So in the future, we'll be able to separate our materials for recycling and have confidence that they're going to something good and causing good, not harm. But importantly, the bill also has some neat innovations that move upstream. Just as an example, the bill will provide tens of millions of dollars funded by producers, not taxpayers, to advance prevention and reuse efforts, such as dishwashers in school cafeterias. Unfortunately, due to a political compromise, that money won't kick in for several more years, but it is in the pipeline and is in statute. I'll mention that we are also seeing some rapid advancements in the area of life cycle assessment, and that is the assessment of the environmental impacts of materials. And this is important because it allows businesses and others to make more informed and evidence-based choices. Just as an example of this, concrete is a very non-sexy material that has a massive climate impact, but not all concrete is the same. And Oregon has pioneered an effort to use life cycle assessment to get it into the hands of different concrete producers and to help them essentially put a carbon footprint label on thousands of different concrete mixes. And now, as a result of that, institutional purchasers such as the city of Portland are beginning to give a preference for lower carbon concrete mixes. So this gets at both the consumption and the production piece. It has nothing to do with recycling, but it's an exciting precedent for how we might start to reduce the environmental impacts of materials writ large. And finally, I'll just mention, I've been working in this space for about 30 years now, and there is definitely more interest in the reduce and reuse parts of reduce, reuse, recycle than I've seen in the past. And that's coming both from the general public and from some businesses. It hasn't manifested itself in a lot of meaningful policy reforms yet, but the conversations are happening and they seem to be picking up speed and momentum. And I take that to be an encouraging and hopeful sign.
Amazing. Well, that's a lot of positive news. What help or support, for your projects and efforts do you need from our audience and community of enthusiastic zero wasters?
Sure, thank you. Well, there is so much that needs to be done at both the individual and the sort of shared or collective level. Let me start with the individual level first, because a lot of people gravitate towards individual action. So obviously we need to recycle better. And part of that involves being very careful not to burden the recycling system and the environment with contamination. Contamination is the material that the recycling system is not prepared to adequately recycle. And upwards of 90% of the residents in the Portland metro region, and I'll guess this might include some recycling advocates as well, do not understand what they're supposed to recycle and what not to. And they put things in the recycling bin that don't belong there. And the consequence of that, it's very corrosive. It really undermines the economics of the state's recycling system. And in a worst case scenario, it results in damage to the environment. Again, if you put some plastics in the bin, for example, in your recycling bin, hoping that they'll be recycled, if our processors aren't set up to sort them out, there's a reasonable chance that some of those plastics are going to end up being exported to some country that lacks even basic landfills, and they're going to end up being dumped and burned and, cause health problems for people, or they're going to end up in the ocean. So we need to be really careful to recycle right. And if you've got a material and you don't know if you can recycle it or not, the best thing to do is to check with your local government. In this state, the local governments or their franchised waste collectors are the ones that are responsible for promoting and sharing information about what and how to recycle. And if you do that and it still isn't clear, the best thing to do is just to put it in your garbage can, where at least it's going to be entombed and it's not going to cause as much harm as it might in the recycling system. Again, however, more important than recycling is using less material in the first place. So avoiding single-use items when you can, buying less stuff, eat the food that you buy, because the production of food has massive environmental impacts, and composting wasted food does very little to offset those impacts. So don't waste food in the first place. And I'm a fan of the old New England adage that says, eat it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. It's not very popular in today's consumer culture, but there's a lot of wisdom in it. Now, having said all of that, there are some real serious limits to individual behavior. Most of the problems we're facing are the result of what I would call structural or societal impediments to sustainability. Zoning codes, the tax code, weak environmental regulations, and so on. Consumers, individuals, can only do so much as individuals in sort of their own lives as consumers. And fortunately, we are more than consumers. Hopefully, that's not actually who we are. That's not our identity. Fixing these bigger structural problems, which would allow everyone to live in a less impactful way, is going to require political will, and it's going to require political power. As an employee of the executive branch, I can't weigh in on specific legislative proposals or candidates or parties, but I will say that successful democracy requires civic engagement. And the environmental community has spent the last 40 years encouraging its members to engage as consumers, buy green things and recycle them. And let me say our consumer muscle has gotten pretty strong, but it seems like it's a little out of proportion with our civic engagement muscle, which at times seems somewhat atrophied. So we need to advocate, and we also need to be careful and thoughtful about what we're advocating for, because if zero waste means putting everything in the recycling bin so that the waste get sorted out in Indonesia and dumped in the ocean, that's not the outcome that anybody wants. Popular wisdom is always popular, and it's not always wise. And as I said at the beginning, we're in a climate crisis. We have an extinction emergency. We need to reduce the environmental impacts of materials across their full life cycle, not just keep stuff out of landfills. The landfill justification is broken, and it should not be the motivation for action. We need to avoid solutions that are penny wise and pound foolish. So my final advice would be to be open to new information, to think critically, to activate your muscles of civic engagement, and to lean in. That's it. Thanks.
Wow. Well, David, that was a ton of really great, useful information. So thank you so much for speaking with us today.
So glad to be with you, and hope to cross paths with you and many of your members in the future.
Please join the conversation, which will continue in the comments section. So please don't be shy, whether you have one question or 10, whether you represent a business or government or community, we all have ideas and connections to offer. This low waste and low consumption lifestyle is for everybody. Working together and doing our part will have lasting positive impacts on our planet and livability. You can help waste-free advocates in whatever way you like, from financial support to joining our board of volunteers. Visit wastefreeadvocates.org for links, and please follow, like, share, and subscribe to Waste Free Advocates to receive notifications of our events and future episodes of the Zero Waste video series that you won't want to miss. We hope to inspire you to inspire others through your positive influence. And remember that when you share what you know and who you know, you multiply the good that you do.
So thank you for tuning in, and keep being an advocate for change in your local community.